Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, the Epoch Times in Hong Kong has been attacked again. As I mentioned previously, Epoch Times is blacklisted in mainland China, but we do have offices in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. And y'all may remember the Chinese Communist Party ended Hong Kong's autonomy during the Hong Kong democracy protests last year. Now, previously, we had individuals masked force their way into our print shop, set it on fire using firebomb. Well, no, they lit it on fire. This time they came in with sledgehammers and knives and smashed the equipment. I'll be going into what happened with it and where things are currently at with it. Also going to be going into a bit of what's happening with the Chinese Communist Party threat to the U.S., go into what's happening with China, Iran, other countries, Trump's comments on court packing. Also going to go a bit into what's happening with the vaccines because there's some new updates on that as well. Including new bans, or at least the ending of usage of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, at least temporarily. All right, folks, good to see you all as usual as well. Yeah, Sam Ernest, hi, good to see you as well. Thank you. Chris Fertel, be careful, Josh. Thank you. Well, in the U.S., this is our Hong Kong office that got attacked, but yeah, it's pretty terrible, actually. And yeah, I mean, they've been threatening our staff for a while now. This kind of stuff is not technically unusual for us at this point, but it does seem to be something that we kind of expect to be increasing going forward, especially when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and what they're doing. All right, that said, folks, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. And in the meantime, let's jump into the first stories for the night. All right, so first off, as I mentioned, first article here, Epoch Times reports, Hong Kong Epoch Times vows to never give up after attack on printing press. And it says here, a day after a violent attack at the printing press of the Hong Kong edition of the Epoch Times, the outlet said it would never give in to intimidation, pressure, or sabotage attempts by the Chinese Communist Party. And they said this at a press conference in Washington on April 3rd, today. Now it continues. It says, in the early hours of Monday, 4 men broke into the printing warehouse of the Hong Kong edition of the Epoch Times. The perpetrators smashed printing equipment with sledgehammers and tossed construction debris on it before fleeing the scene in a white van. They threatened the staff on site to not to do anything that would compel them to take action. The printing plant suffered extensive damage from the assault, which affected multiple computers, the transmitter, and a CPU. The printing equipment, right? The computers for the printing equipment. And this also forced the Hong Kong edition to suspend printing for the time being. And so currently our edition in Hong Kong cannot print our newspaper. Now that said, June Guo, the director of the Hong Kong edition of the Epoch Times, said the attack was the latest in a long line of actions aimed at crippling the outlet. And she said, quote, the Chinese Communist Party has used every trick in the book to suppress the Epoch Times in Hong Kong in an attempt to prevent the city's people from getting independent news. And remember, the Chinese Communist Party forcefully overtook Hong Kong. They were supposed to have an agreement where until, I think, 2049, the Chinese Communist Party was not supposed to have complete control over Hong Kong. Hong Kong was supposed to maintain a democratic system. Right, that was the one country, two systems, technically under the CCP, but they were having their own independent system. That is not the case now. The Chinese Communist Party overtook that. Now, she continued stating, quote, the Epoch Times is one of the few remaining voices in the Hong Kong media landscape that does not bend to the CCP. And while the Epoch Times Hong Kong will increase security measures, that in itself is not enough to counter the effect in declining press freedom. Now, with this said, we've actually seen some support on the U.S. side. So our staff, they held a press conference in Washington, D.C. Earlier today, where, again, the head of our Hong Kong office spoke, where our publisher, Stephen Gregory, spoke, and where a few other staff spoke. And they did get some support. It does seem to be the case that some media may be working on stories about it. We'll have to see how that goes because some of them haven't been too favorable of us, honestly. But we have received some support from the U.S. government, actually, which was nice to see. Next story here is the U.S. State Department denounces attack on Hong Kong Epoch Times printing press. And the State Department, it says, according to Epoch Times, on April 13th, today again, denounced the assault by masked intruders on the printing facility of the Hong Kong edition of the Epoch Times and is urging officials in the city to investigate the incident. And a State Department spokesman said, quote, "We condemn the attack on the Epoch Times printing plant and urge the Hong Kong authorities to thoroughly investigate and bring the perpetrators to justice. The United States is concerned by increased efforts to silence independent media and otherwise suppress freedom of expression, including the politically motivated targeting of journalists. We are committed to standing up for press freedom and freer and wider access to information and ideas around the world. Freedom of expression, including for members of the press, is critical to transparency." So it was actually nice to see the U.S. State Department step in to condemn the attacks. Now, we'll have to see what happens going forward. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, has overtaken Hong Kong. They've begun arresting Hong Kong dissidents. They've begun arresting people who are protesting, calling for democracy in Hong Kong, which is supposed to, again, have a separate system from the Chinese Communist Party, but the CCP has forcefully ended that. And now the question is how much the rest of the world pushes back. The question now is what happens going forward. Are these types of activities allowed, or does the international community step in to condemn it? And we actually have seen, not just in the US, but other countries as well, actually a lot of support for the Epoch Times, and even from folks who may be politically, not very favorable towards us. It was nice to see some of them actually step forward to condemn these attacks as well. Now, we'll again see what happens. Yeah, James Woolley notes Joshua Wong sent to prison. Joshua Wong was one of the major leaders of the Hong Kong democracy protests, and the CCP went after him as well. And so Hong Kong is becoming much less free, and the Epoch Times, of course, is one of the only independent voices in Hong Kong. I think there's one other local newspaper there that is technically independent. And so terrible for Hong Kong. Of course, terrible for the Epoch Times, because right now, again, we can't print the newspaper because they destroyed our printing press. Hopefully we'll get it repaired soon. We'll keep you all updated on what happens with it. Now, that said, folks, this channel again, oh, actually, we can show the video. Let's see if we can show the video, because we actually have security camera footage capturing this. Let's jump into that now. Now, as you can see, these individuals forced their way in. They allegedly made threatening statements to the person who was at the door, forced their way in threateningly. Again, they used their sledgehammers to smash our printing press. They apparently had a knife as well, which they did not use apparently on the printing press, which means that was mainly for the intimidation factor. They smashed, again, the machines, made them unusable, then dumped debris. Yeah, you see them dumping the debris on the press, presumably trying to jam it up, making sure we can't use it anymore. And so our ability right now to print in Hong Kong is disabled because of these individuals. And we'll have to see what happens. Now, previously, as I mentioned, similar incidents. I think this is the fourth attack we've had in Hong Kong. The last one, they, again, set our printers on fire. They, I think, caused, $40,000 in damage last time. It took us a bit to get back on, but we were back online. This one, they really, really smashed things up. And so we'll have to see how fast we can get back on. And of course, we are talking to the police in Hong Kong, but we'll see how that goes, given the current state in Hong Kong, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But, again, the CCP has taken over Hong Kong. And so we'll see what we can do. Hopefully we'll be back online again soon in Hong Kong. Now, that said, folks, Crossroads is, as well, totally demonetized by YouTube. We tried getting it back up, not able to get it back up yet. And so really, it's you folks keeping us going. So we do have a Patreon. We do have a donor box if you want to support Crossroads or the Epoch Times. We do accept donations. And also, folks, we do have a sponsor for the night, which is American Hartford Gold. And so big thanks to them. And again, tonight's sponsor is American Hartford Gold. With all the turbulence with the economy, the stock market, and with risks of inflation, you can consider investing in an asset that is often stable and that has been on the incline, that is gold and silver. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, please check out the link in the comments below, where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. And even if you just want to learn about investing in gold, check them out. Now, if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver on all qualifying first orders. The number is 877-260-2764, or you can text Joshua to 65532. Now, folks, a few of you had asked about, is this the Chinese mafia? Now, it might be, actually. One important thing to note how the Chinese Communist Party operates in a lot of countries, including here in the United States, is they control the legitimate society and the illegitimate society. A lot of that's done through the United Front Work Department, which is a branch of the Chinese government. Basically, what they do is they operate through the Chinese consulates. The Chinese consulates then go to the Tongs, the fraternal organizations that work as kind of the unofficial governing bodies of Chinese communities. These are groups like the Shandong Association, the Fujian American Association. They have student Tongs, they have oil worker Tongs, they have police Tongs. They have Tongs in just about every industry in every country. Now, beneath some of the Tongs, not all of them, are the Chinese street gangs. And the system between the Chinese street gangs and the Tongs is what would constitute what's called the triads, the Chinese mafia. Groups like the Ghost Shadows, like the On Liang gang, like the Fuqing gang, one of the largest transnational criminal organizations in the world, which does have ties to the CCP through the United Front. They operate under the Fujian American Association in New York, at least. Now, when it comes to how they use these organizations in other countries, in Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party is known to work directly with the Chinese mafia. You had individuals such as, I can't remember the guy's name, they call him the White Wolf. He's known, convicted extortionist, engaged in stuff like this, known to work openly with the Chinese Communist Party. In Hong Kong, they had the White Shirts, individuals who were attacking the Hong Kong democracy protesters. Some of the bloodiest attacks on the protesters were from the White Shirts. And so, in these countries, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even a lot of Asia in general, the CCP tends to be very aggressive with its use of the Chinese street gangs. They've done some stuff in the U.S. as well. Actually, some of my original work on investigative work, 2008 to about 2012, my beat for a long time was investigating the stuff, especially in New York. And they're very active in New York as well. Now, folks, I'm going to go over some questions in just a bit, but first let's go over some more stories. And so, again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. First off, let's go over what's happening with the Chinese Communist Party, because there are some updates on this. Now, first of all, Epoch Times reports Chinese Communist Party listed atop of U.S. intelligence's worldwide threat assessment. And it says here, the regime in China poses the leading challenge to U.S. national security, followed by Russia, Iran, and North Korea, in the annual threat assessment report compiled by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. Now, the Co-Ro noted Chan An-lo is the White Wolf, this triad leader. I believe he's in Taiwan. Yeah, Chang An-lo. He's known, he's public, and he works very closely with the CCP. Openly. It's open in some of these countries. Continuing though on this threat assessment, now the CCP will, quote, continue its whole of government efforts to spread China's influence, undercut that of the United States, drive wedges between Washington and its allies and partners, and foster new international norms that favor the authoritarian Chinese system, according to the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And it continues, this is according to the threat assessment, right? Stating, quote, Chinese leaders probably will, however, seek tactical opportunities to reduce tensions with Washington when such opportunities suit their interests, saying that it is a matter of the regime's, quote, survival. And so, in other words, the CCP's survival depends on it using aggression or talks of peace whenever they see the need for it. The Chinese Communist Party can aggressively take the South China Sea. The Chinese Communist Party can carry out literal genocide, designated genocide, inside its own borders. The Chinese Communist Party can use slave labor. And when people criticize the CCP of this, when they say, hey, slavery is wrong, we're living in, current year, right? When they try to call the Chinese Communist Party for these things, the CCP says, how dare you? You have a history of doing these things as well. But they're not noting that, well, the rest of the world got rid of it. Chinese Communist Party is still practicing it. Again, genocide, slave labor, taking by force different regions in the world, and using aggression when necessary and using calls for peace when necessary as they do these things. Now it continues stating this, quote, Chinese leaders probably will, however, seek tactical opportunities to reduce tensions with Washington again. And it says, China is touting its success containing the COVID-19 pandemic as evidence of the superiority of its communist system. The report notes, adding that it will continue to combine its military power with its economic, technological, and diplomatic clout to preserve the CCP at Washington's expense. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party, lying to the world again about the success of controlling the virus, using that as a propaganda front, feeding that narrative to the Western media outlets, many of which have been repeating it, and claiming that its success in dealing with it is an example that its system of totalitarian rule under the Chinese Communist Party is a system for other countries to replicate. This is them trying to promote their new system of government, this totalitarian Marxist system of government. Now, it continues stating that at the same time as all this is happening, the CCP will try to muffle criticism of China. And if you consider the attacks on Epoch Times in Hong Kong, I would say that is them trying to muffle criticism, trying to silence us. Right, trying to silence any voices that could say otherwise, that could expose what they're doing. And it says Beijing has been intensifying efforts to shape the political environment in the United States to promote its policy preferences. And yes, the Chinese Communist Party does this heavily. You can in fact watch the interview we just published, I think yesterday, talking about the Chinese Communist Party's systems of political warfare, how they use things like the disintegration strategy, meant to whittle away countries from the inside, to disintegrate governments through corruption, through getting officials in these countries to support foreign regimes, by getting countries to commit technical economic suicide, to get them to destroy themselves from within, to focus on things that are not necessary, to turn against each other, to fight on the street rather than dealing with the problems that really matter. This is one of the big focuses of the Chinese Communist Party. And it says this as well. It says the report further notes that China's conventional and nuclear forces will try to construct more overseas military bases, not just like they're doing in the South China Sea, but in other ways as well, like what they call these string of pearls, the building of military bases at every major trade choke point. And if they control trade choke points, they control international trade, and they can deny access or allow access as they see fit. And it says, quote, Beijing will press Taiwan authorities to move toward unification and will condemn what it views as increased U.S.-Taiwan engagement. We expect that friction will grow as Beijing steps up attempts to portray Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, as internationally isolated and dependent on the mainland for economic prosperity, and as China continues to increase its military activity around the island. And it says China's increasing cooperation with Russia on areas of complementary interest includes defense and economic cooperation. And that's what's next. The Chinese Communist Party is threatening Taiwan. It's moving forward its timetable for overtaking Taiwan after it took Hong Kong. Taiwan is a self-governing island, independent island, its own government, its own separate group of people, many of whom, again, long story short, After the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese Communist Party took over, and the official government of China, which was the Kuomintang, fled to the island of Taiwan, right? The island of Formosa. They established the Taiwan as a country. And the Taiwanese people now fear, many of whom are afraid, that the Chinese Communist Party will say, "You're next," because the CCP has been talking about forcefully taking Taiwan for a long time now. The U.S. is suggesting that it will protect Taiwan. It's not saying directly it will protect it, but it's saying it will, back Taiwan for Taiwan's own self-defense. And so we'll have to see how this goes moving forward. But the people of Taiwan are saying they will fight to the end if the CCP tries to take them. Now, as this happens, just a few other parts to this. Real quick, Japan's policy turns to confrontation in 2021. Epoch Times reports since the start of 2021, significant changes have sprung up in the diplomatic ties between two East Asian countries, Japan and China. Currently, the Japanese government is making a dramatic turn to confront China over a range of issues, including the disputed waters in the East and South China Seas, Taiwan, and the human rights situation in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And as this happens as well, Australia is being pulled into it. It says here, Beijing, another story, Beijing's naval strategy may target Australia's largest ports. And it says here, a leading Australian policy think tank has warned the federal government in Australia that the Chinese military may seek to control ports in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney via state-owned enterprises, SOEs, as part of a broader ambition to project the communist regime's power globally. And so what do we see here? Japan especially is talking about stepping in possibly to defend Taiwan. Japan is stepping up to the plate. Remember, one of the big things that happened with Trump before he left office is he established the Quad Alliance. This alliance between India, the United States, Australia, and Japan. And we see now Australia, Japan, and India all having disputes with China. India has the border disputes after the Chinese Communist Party killed many of their soldiers along their border. Went both ways allegedly, but we know that the CCP killed the Indian soldiers. We don't know the numbers on the other side. The CCP attacked Indian soldiers, killed many of them. India has become very anti-CCP over this. Australia has turned somewhat against the CCP, at the very least become aware of what's happening, even though the CCP is pretty far advanced in subverting Australia. Actually, a lot of stories about the local government in Australia being subverted through Chinese Communist Party front operations. As we see here now, Chinese state-owned enterprises, in other words, Chinese businesses, are starting to overtake different key ports in Australia. And if they control that, they can have influence over the Australian Navy and naval capabilities. And at the same time, Japan now becoming more active. Now with this alliance, aligning against the Chinese Communist Party and possibly supporting Taiwan, at the very least Japan's showing signs of at least support for Taiwan, this may act to dissuade the CCP to some extent from moving forward too quickly with its plans to overtake Taiwan, but we'll see how it goes. Now, on this note, remember a while back we talked about this individual. It was a report of one of the main individuals who was an advisor to Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, and to the United Front, right, the main group that runs these types of operations. One of the individuals on the United Front side, one of the main people advising, in other words, the operations for subversion. One of the things he talked about, we talked about this a few episodes ago, one of the things this individual talked about was that the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party is to get the U.S. involved in other wars, to get the U.S. involved in other conflicts. They said that they were using, for example, terrorism, getting the U.S. focused on terrorism. Who was the biggest sponsor of terrorism? Iran. And now the Chinese Communist Party is re-engaging heavily with Iran, heavily with North Korea, and heavily with Russia. And suddenly you see these countries becoming a bit more aggressive. The North Korean regime, for example, is now again threatening nuclear war. They're threatening attacks. The Iranian government now is starting to threaten Israel. We'll go into that in just a minute. The Russian government is talking about threats from Ukraine, and they're now moving to train their military and work on military preparedness. And they're positioning troops to train, especially in the eastern parts of Russia. Now, on the part of Iran, let's go into this. Wall Street Journal just reported this. It says Iran says it will enrich uranium to 60%, an effort to strengthen hand in nuclear talks. It says the move would bring Tehran one step closer to weapons-grade fuel and comes after an attack on Natanz facility blamed on Israel. Now, remember, there was allegedly a cyber attack on one of Iran's nuclear facilities. They said this was equivalent to a military-level attack, right, on their nuclear facility. And they're blaming, right, they're blaming now Israel for this. Now, we'll see what this means when it comes to practice, but the Chinese Communist Party working together with these different alliances does seem to be pulling the strings and getting the U.S. focused on other conflicts. Iran is now a conflict. North Korea is now a conflict. Russia is maybe a conflict. If it falls short of actual war, which it very likely will because these countries know how to play the game, it means the U.S. is now distracted with at least 3 different enemies. But as we mentioned previously, just a bit ago, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, views the Chinese Communist Party as the primary threat. Now, will it stay focused on the CCP as the main threat as it begins interfacing with these other countries and getting them to stir up trouble again to get the U.S. focused on other security issues? It seems to be the case that this is part of the game. If the Chinese Communist Party can get other countries involved in, say, hostile incidents, which divert the attention of the United States, it gives it a smokescreen, so to speak, to move forward with other agendas, such as taking Taiwan by force. And all these things right now are aligning pretty clearly around this. Now, that said, the Biden administration, another story here, is moving to expand its military presence in Germany, which is a reversal of a Trump-era policy. And Epoch Times reports this. The Biden administration will station hundreds of additional troops in Germany as early as this fall, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said during his visit to Europe. And he said this, quote, I briefed the minister of our intention to permanently stage an approximately 500 additional U.S. personnel in the Wiesbaden area. He said this during on Tuesday at a press conference in Berlin. He said, quote, these forces will strengthen deterrence and defense in Europe. And he said they will augment our existing abilities to prevent conflict and, if necessary, fight and win. The move by the administration of President Joe Biden is reversing the policy of former President Donald Trump, who sought during his term as commander-in-chief to have 1,200 troops removed from the country, saying Germany has been, quote, delinquent in its payments to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. They said this back then. He said, quote, so we're protecting Germany and they're delinquent. That doesn't make sense. So I said we're going to bring down the count to 25,000 soldiers. Trump said that he announced the plans in June 2019, adding that Germany treats the United States very badly on trade. Now, keep in mind, Trump was not talking about pulling troops out of Germany altogether. He said keeping the number down to 25,000. And if Biden's only increasing that number by about 500 troops, right? He's only putting 500 additional troops there. It's not a major shift. Really, it seems more that he's strengthening U.S. posturing in the region. Now, why would they talk? Now, keep in mind, we are not moving our troops out of Germany, nor was that Trump's total intention. The concern of moving U.S. troops out of Europe was that basically the United States subsidizes military payments in these countries, which lets these countries basically run very expensive social welfare programs because we basically pay for the defense. The United States shoulders the defense budget of much of Europe. Europe uses the extra money to pour it into these different social justice programs, these different welfare programs and things like that. Basically, the U.S. is subsidizing socialism in Europe by covering their defense budgets, partly. And Trump was basically saying these countries need to step up to the plate, start paying their share of global defense, and that was part of the goal with that. Not pulling troops out entirely, but maintaining, again, 25,000 by removing 12,000. Now, Biden is talking about adding 500 back in, which is not a significant difference. Now, in my opinion, it would be nice if Germany were to step up to the plate more, as it would be if much of Europe would step up to the plate more and not have the United States basically finance NATO. The U.S. covers much of the NATO budget and the UN budget for that matter, and other countries don't pay their share. The U.S. subsidizes, again, defense for a lot of these countries, and because they have more money in their budgets, because they're not paying for their own defense to a large extent, they were able to have these socialist policies, again, because they have more of a budget. Now, if the U.S. stops paying as much and other countries pay their share, it balances out a bit. That said, going forward, there are real threats now from Iran, from Russia, unfortunately, and from the Chinese Communist Party and from other countries. And so maybe, unfortunately, U.S. troop presence will be necessary in these regions. Even with that troop presence, it would be nice if these other countries, in my opinion, did pay their share as well, because things aren't looking so hot in terms of global security right about now. Now, that said, folks, let's jump into a few questions, and then after that, we'll go into a few more stories. I want to talk about Trump's comments on court packing. I want to go into the vaccines, and we'll see if we can get into some other stories like the return of Black Lives Matter, what's happening with that. But first, again, let's go into some questions. So again, folks, if you have questions, leave them in the chat, and I'll try to get to them. First off here, we have a question from Helena Lewis. He said, question, is Hong Kong your only printing press? Why not America? No, Epoch Times is in, I think, 23 countries and 17 languages. We print our papers, we're daily in the U.S. We have a printing press in New York. We have printing presses in other parts of the U.S. Again, we're blacklisted in mainland China, but we do print in Hong Kong, Taiwan. We also have a Japanese edition. We have editions in quite a few countries. That said, we're in Canada. We're in a lot of Europe. We're not daily in all these countries, but we do have printing presses in a lot of countries. The U.S. edition, New York, is printed in New York. Other parts of the U.S. are printed locally as well, and so this does not impact our ability to print the paper in the U.S. or elsewhere, but it does impact our ability to print in Hong Kong. And so it is a pretty big blow in Hong Kong. Now, that said, of course, we're trying to get back online, and we'll see what happens. We do still have the online version in Chinese. And we also, thanks to circumvention software, people even in mainland China are able to get around the firewall that the CCP uses to try to block people from accessing information outside of China. And they do access Epoch Times using that. And so we are one of the big voices in China because people can get around the firewall, and also one of the few voices of freedom, not just in Hong Kong and Taiwan, where the Chinese Communist Party is trying to, again, move forward with its agenda, but also in other parts of the world where you have Chinatowns. Now, next question here is from Pastor Kenny. Good seeing you. He said, Joshua, thank you for your reporting. My pleasure, and thanks for being here. He said, question, in light of the current mainstream cancel culture and CCP influence in the U.S., do you see hope of the pendulum swinging back to correct the course in future, to correct our course in future? I do, actually. I actually do, and I know people feel pretty hopeless right now, especially here in the U.S., as we've seen what's been happening with cancel culture, with protests, with riots, with the very extreme mainstream media. I think, remember, folks, Trump got more votes than any other president in U.S. history, if the polls were right, 74 million to 80 million votes. You also, again, you had CNN, right? Project Veritas just had a video showing undercover comments from CNN admitting, one of the main folks there, one of the management folks there, I should say, admitting on record on undercover camera that they were using propaganda with the intention of, lying about Trump and getting him out of office. A lot of what you're seeing is smoke and mirrors. A lot of what you're seeing with the mainstream media is just smoke and mirrors. And, a lot of it's emotional manipulation. A lot of it's trying to stir people up. A lot of it's using, college kids and things like this who, change after, sometimes when they reach their 30s, they switch their political viewpoints. A lot of these things are playing on the same types of operations you've been seeing, going back again to late 1800s even, when you had the anarchist and socialist riots across the United States, leading up to the bombing of Wall Street. Same thing you had with the red flag revolutions. Same thing when you had with, leading up through the 60s and the cultural revolution we had during the 60s. You do unfortunately have a lot of people, falling for these, I'd say, disinformation, because that's what it is. But at the same time, you have real voices of freedom. And going forward, I do think that the grassroots in the United States is about to take off. I've discussed this quite a few times on the show, so I won't go too deep into it tonight. I think the last episode, we went pretty deep into it. But just to sum it up, I think we're going to see really two separate economies come up in the U.S. Part of this, I do believe, is going to be because we're going to have Trump's new social media, which I think can actually have a big impact, right? Trump's new social media, that means infrastructure, right? Internet infrastructure that people can use for hosting that can't be censored. You're going to have an ad network tied to it, which means advertising, which means people willing to advertise and not afraid of cancel culture. You're going to have people, a platform for journalists, for video makers, for other people who really back in 2016 were some of the loudest, most prominent voices on the internet, which was why you had, again, you had mainstream media coming out with these different stories, narratives, quotes, headlines, saying things like this, right? Saying that, the alt-right controls YouTube. The alt-right is the most prominent voice on YouTube. The alt-right is the most prominent voice on Facebook and Twitter and social media and anything else. They found that any platform left uncensored tends to lean towards conservative viewpoints. When you allow independent voices, typically the ones that are the most honest are the ones that remain. And that's why they use cancel culture to prevent people from speaking their minds. Because when you let people speak their minds, when you let them debate, false ideas die. And now that we're going to have uncensored platforms, and really it's going to be a big blow, I think, to cancel culture, you're getting ready to see within the next, I'd say, 1 to 2 months, maybe 2 months more likely, you're going to start seeing this battle of ideas really, really start. And among that battle of ideas, you're also going to see ad networks. You're going to see advertisers getting on these platforms and, again, moving forward with that. Yeah, Molly, John, you said, lol, we are all considered alt-right. That's the irony with a lot of these statements, too, is they lost their meaning. It's one thing if you attack people, of course, Antifa calls everybody Nazis. That word loses its weight if you call everybody that, right? Same with the alt-right. If you call everybody who you don't agree with alt-right, the word loses its meaning. A lot of these folks have really, I'd say, it's like boy who cried wolf syndrome, right? Who takes it serious when you have the head of Department of Defense talking about white supremacy in the U.S. military, when they've been using the whole white guilt narrative for the past 4 years and really targeting people on really ridiculous things sometimes. A lot of these things have lost their weight. And so you have right now a media industry, a business industry, and a political industry which has become disconnected from the grassroots of the American people. And the only way they can maintain control on the grassroots is through cancel culture. They need to censor you in order to look like they control you. They need to censor you in order to make sure that no voices disputing what they're saying can stand up and speak out. The whole reason behind censorship is to eliminate voices that they could not challenge and win through open debate. And so recognize that and don't be afraid of what you're up against, in my opinion. All it's going to take, again, is a platform they cannot censor, and the whole thing's over with, in my opinion. This is from Chanel Riwa. He said, Josh, can you talk about Charlie Chester's revealing about CNN propaganda? The next plan to make people in turmoil after COVID is climate change. Yes. So Project Veritas, again, James O'Keefe, head of Project Veritas, they do undercover journalism. And a lot of people have attacked them for doing this. But I should note, if you read the Journalist Code of Ethics, right, the Code of Ethics for journalists, they would call this surreptitious methods, surreptitious methodologies, which is where you're able to go undercover, and get stories. They say that that is acceptable for journalism only if you believe that surreptitious reporting can yield information that cannot be gotten otherwise. In other words, if you were to ask people, confront them, and interview them, and say, "Hey, what's up with this?" and they're going to say no comment, or just lie to your face. If you believe that you cannot get the accurate information through normal reporting methods, surreptitious methodologies, i.e., undercover reporting, is necessary. That is what Project Veritas does. And so, agree with them or disagree with them. They do have Prima 61. Journalists have ethics. There are written ethics for journalism. Unfortunately, not many journalists these days follow them. But there is a journalist code of ethics. And again, Project Veritas practices surreptitious reporting, undercover reporting. Now, one of the individuals they got was one of the higher-ups at CNN, one of the managers at CNN, speaking on undercover video. And the video shows this individual saying, in his own words, that CNN was using, quote, propaganda, in his opinion, right? It was his opinion on the methods they were using. And he was saying as well that basically they were reporting things without knowing whether or not they were true about Trump, lying about Trump with the intention of getting him out of office. In other words, they were doing what a lot of mainstream media accuses pretty much anyone they disagree with of doing, which is using disinformation. Disinformation it's basically changing the footnotes of arguments. Disinformation is creating, 1,000 lies and then using 1,000 lies as the underlying narrative. And so if you want to discredit the underlying narrative, you need to discredit 1,000 lies. And what they do is this. Trump's a racist. Based on what? Based on reports that were false, based on quotes taken out of context, and based on, anonymous sources who claimed they heard something. That was the basis of that. Things like Trump is a Russian agent. Based on what? Based on a dossier compiled by an organization hired by the Clinton campaign and the DNC, none of which was ever proven true. Disinformation, altering the footnotes of arguments in order to make meta narratives, right? And so you use the footnotes as the narrative for the meta story. And that's exactly what they did, right? Exactly the stuff they were doing. And here we have, again, Project Veritas caught an individual at CNN admitting this type of reporting on record. And it's interesting to note that now this individual is saying that the next thing they're going to be doing this with, this disinformation, is climate change, using that same method of reporting to push the climate change narrative. And as we have individuals in the U.S. government now pushing for Green New Deal framework, they're not calling it Green New Deal, but the infrastructure plan, pretty much the entire agenda they have laid out, it pulls from the Green New Deal. And they're going to need the media narrative feeding that, right? The media narrative is going to be feeding that. And so you do have them moving on that already, and they're already suggesting that their next step is going to be this. Oh, yeah, real quick, too, folks. I mentioned that I got invited to be on Tucker Carlson. It was supposed to be today. It unfortunately fell through because of the riots happening right now in, I believe, Minnesota. And so we're trying to reschedule. It's still on, just trying to reschedule. So just heads up, update on that. I'll go over a couple more questions, and we'll go into some more stories. Mark Kirby, you asked, do you think China will make a move on Taiwan sometime this summer? 50-50, 60-40, 20-80% chance of an attack. It's hard to say, to be honest. I can give you my analysis on what's going to happen with Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party has been basically testing the waters. For example, if you were to launch a cyber attack, what do? Right? If you were to launch a cyber attack, you'll test the waters. You'll launch a smaller attack and see what the response time is. You'll see how people react. You'll see how big the reaction is. You'll see the bodies that get involved with it. When you have a country, for example, making air incursions into another country's airspace, Russia does it to the United States, China does it to Taiwan, stuff happens, right? They do this. I'll give you a few examples. I'm sure you've all seen stories about, Japan scrambling jets against, the Chinese aircraft incursions on their territory. You've all seen stories about Taiwan scrambling jets. So basically, Chinese Communist Party sends jets into their airspace. They respond and send jets to chase them out. Why do countries do that? It's because they're testing the waters. What does it show, right? You want to say, how far were we able to get into their borders before they responded? Timing of response, right? What is the timing of the response? How many jets do they send to? How many jets do they scramble to deal with the situation? Which jets do they scramble? From which airport do they launch? What is the response time? Which networks of communication are involved? Who are the key individuals involved in that whole process? How long does it take for them to deal with it? What is the response afterwards? So on and so on and so on. They look at the entire reaction process, right? That's part of intelligence gathering, part of the process of seeing how a country reacts to an incident, and then building a strategy to use those responses to move and navigate within those responses to find an attack strategy. Every country does it. And it's not just with jets. They do this with cyber attacks. They do this with other things as well. Politics, business, you name it. What did the Chinese Communist Party just do? Right? They overtook Hong Kong. They ended Hong Kong's autonomy. The CCP took over Hong Kong. What else did the Chinese Communist Party do? They built artificial islands and they took over the South China Sea. They're carrying out actual genocide, actual slave labor. What is the international response? Does the international community care more about the values they claim to care about? History of slavery, abuses against minorities, religious freedom, freedom of the press, right? All of which the CCP is brutally discarding and violating. Or do they care more about money, right? What do you think? How many businesses are still active in China? Despite all this, how many investors are still pouring money into China? How many countries still engage with the Chinese Communist Party despite all these things, right? What was the response after the Chinese Communist Party ended Hong Kong's autonomy? And how long did the response last? How long did the bad press last, right? A year? You can imagine, based on this, that if the CCP were to overtake Taiwan using the same method as Hong Kong, maybe a year of bad press, maybe some sanctions. The CCP is working on its digital currency, so it's not going to matter pretty soon, anyways, with the sanctions. Unless they militarily defend Taiwan, nothing matters. Sanctions don't matter because the CCP is about to launch its new digital currency. If they're able to do that and launch it globally, that is the end of U.S. sanctions, and that is the end of the U.S.-led international order, which uses sanctions and other things to punish countries for violating human rights. That is the end of it. If Japan and U.S. and hopefully other countries as well don't intervene and prevent the CCP from doing that, yeah, that's the start of it. CCP has the ability to do it. And unfortunately, folks, there have been different U.S. war games, and it's unclear how accurate they are because these tend to have their issues as well, right? U.S. war games show the Chinese Communist Party winning in a localized war over Hong Kong against even the United States. Now, it's unclear exactly how accurate those war games are. My criticism of many folks, and take this, I respect our military, but unfortunately a lot of the officers are still educated within the U.S. system, and some of them even interface with the CCP pretty regularly. And frankly, I'd be very concerned about how close some of these individuals are with the Chinese Communist Party and the integrity of their assessments based on this. Plenty of good folks as well, don't get me wrong, but take it on that note. There's mixed issues with this. But U.S. assessments do show the U.S. losing a localized battle, unfortunately, with the Chinese Communist Party in that area. Some of it's based on pretty solid ground. For example, them not being able to, basically stage aircraft, air battles, not having local bases to refuel, resupply, and so on. There are some pretty serious issues. All right, folks, let's move into a few more stories because it's getting a bit late. I want to talk first about what's happening with the virus because there's some pretty big issues with this. All right. So we talked before about the issues with, for example, the Pfizer vaccines. We talked, for example, what was it, the Moderna? We'll get into it. Just give me a minute. Let's go first with the Johnson & Johnson one. Latest update. U.S. recommends pausing Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine after reports of blood clots. In Epoch Times reports, U.S. health officials are recommending Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine not be used until an investigation into cases of post-vaccination blood clots is finished. The 6 cases, all among women, involve a rare and severe type of clot called cerebral venous thrombosis in combination with low levels of blood platelets. Forgive me if I'm saying all this wrong. And it continues. Officials told reporters in a call on April 13th, one of the patients died, while a second is in critical condition at a hospital. The patients are between the ages of 18 and 48, who experienced the symptoms between 6 and 13 days after getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And Dr. Peter Marks, director of the Food and Drug Administration, FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, said, quote, "Right now, these adverse events appear to be extremely rare." Now, more than 6.8 million doses of Johnson & Johnson shots have been administered in the United States as of April 12th. And Trump is weighing in on it now. And here's what Trump is saying. Another article here. Trump says, federal pause in Johnson & Johnson vaccine, quote, done for politics, or FDA's love for Pfizer. And this is Trump's opinion, Trump's statement on it. He said this. Epoch Times reports, former President Donald Trump said the federal government is doing a, quote, terrible disservice to Americans by halting usage of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, while saying it may have been halted due to, quote, possibly political reasons. It came after the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control Prevention recommended a pause in using the J&J COVID-19 shot. And Trump said, quote, the results of this vaccine have been extraordinary, but now its reputation will be permanently challenged. The people who have already taken the vaccine will be up in arms, and perhaps all of this was done for politics, or perhaps it's it's the FDA's love for Pfizer. Now, I won't go too deep into it, but there's been some issues. Some issues with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that they use again aborted fetal tissues. There was controversy on that. We also talked about the AstraZeneca vaccine being banned in many European countries, also for rare blood clots. And we also talked just the other recent episode about the Pfizer shot having some controversies in Israel. And remember that a Tel Aviv university found that a South African variant of the virus affected people with a Pfizer shot more than people who weren't even vaccinated. Again, it was 5.4% against 0.7% unvaccinated, meaning several times more people were getting it if you had the Pfizer shot than if you weren't even vaccinated in the first place. And so there are some issues with this. And maybe the banning, if Trump's opinion is correct on this, maybe the banning of the Johnson & Johnson shot is to give room for the Pfizer shot, which is now facing controversy because of the Israeli report. Unclear what's going on with it, but all these reports are having different types of issues right now. But again, it's Russian roulette. You want to get the vaccine? Fine. You don't want to get the vaccine? Fine. There's risks either way right now, of course. Now, real quick, also, I want to talk about court packing because Biden's talking about packing the courts. And he's assigned a group to look into how to do it. And Trump is now talking about this. Now, Trump has said this, politically correct Supreme Court will get what it deserves if court is expanded. Interesting take on what's happening with the Supreme Court. Trump said this, Epoch Times says, it says, former President Donald Trump reacted to White House plans to create a commission that would study potentially expanding the Supreme Court, among other proposals. Trump said that because the High Court didn't hear election-related cases after November 3rd, the justices on the Supreme Court will, quote, get what they deserve if it's expanded. And he said, quote, "Now there is a very good chance they will be diluted and moved throughout the court system so they can see how the lower courts work, with many new justices added to the court, far more than has been reported. There is also a good chance that they will be term limited." And Trump said of the Supreme Court as he renewed claims of election fraud during the 2020 election. And he continued saying, quote, "Our politically correct Supreme Court will get what they deserve, an unconstitutionally elected group of radical left Democrats who are destroying our country." And folks, remember what happened with the Supreme Court. Technically, Republicans had the majority. Remember, Trump put in quite a few justices and technically had the majority when the cases brought by Trump's legal team, brought by Lin Wood, brought by Sidney Powell, brought by others, when they were supposed to be heard by the Supreme Court. What did the Supreme Court do? They refused to hear the cases and did not even give reasons for doing so. And so Trump is saying they're politically correct and serves them right. Now, the irony with the Supreme Court right now is that Biden is talking about packing the courts, adding new seats, right? Adding new Supreme Court justices, basically, which would give him not only control of the presidency, not only control of the House and Senate, because the Democrats have control, and they're even talking about getting rid of the filibuster, but also controlling the judiciary, meaning that through manipulation, they would control all three branches of government. Biden is not satisfied. Democrats are not satisfied with just controlling the executive branch, just controlling the White House. They want to control the Congressional. They want to control Congress, right? They want to control, again, Congress by getting rid of the filibuster, which they're discussing. And they want to control the judiciary by expanding the court, by packing the courts. And so they want absolute power, and they're doing things that are very unethical, even by standards that would have been debated even under Obama, I'd say. And that's where things are at with that currently. And Trump saying serves them right because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do anyway. Trump said serves them right, right? And on that note, too, guess who's back? Black Lives Matter. And get ready, folks, for the next wave of riots and burning and looting over what's happening right now. I will talk about that in just a sec. The drink tonight, by the way, is black tea, Newman's Own black tea. All right, folks. So you might remember all the riots that swept the country during the 2020 elections, right? Remember how everyone was told to stay inside their houses, and that if you went outside, you were killing grandma and you were going to make everyone sick, and how if you go to a Trump rally, you're going to have cross infections and create a national crisis because you're going to spread the virus to everybody, and how you couldn't go outside your house to go order food, and how you couldn't go visit your friends or family, and if you're in the UK, you couldn't even go in your backyard and take care of your garden. You couldn't even garden or take your dog for a walk. But when it came time to riot and burn down your city and loot people and murder, that was okay, right? That was totally allowed. And here now we have it coming back. Epoch Times reports rioting ensues in Minnesota after police shooting of Daunte Wright. It says here violent demonstrations erupted in Minnesota and elsewhere late Monday as people angry over the police shooting of a 20-year-old man the day prior ransacked stores and threw bottles, bricks, and other projectiles at law enforcement officers. Approximately 40 people were arrested in Brooklyn Center, where the April 11th shooting occurred, for crimes including curfew violations and rioting. Colonel Matt Langer of the Minnesota State Police told reporters during a briefing just after midnight on Tuesday. Now, folks, you have a few different riots already planned. Black Lives Matter's announced riots in all the normal places. New York, New Jersey. They're looking at, I think, Fort Lee, which is interestingly an Asian neighborhood. Maybe because of the whole Stop Asia hate thing, they want to stage riots in Asian neighborhoods for some reason. Interesting choice of places. Minnesota, other parts of the U.S. Get ready again for a repeat of the last riots. They're already moving forward with it. Now, this individual, Daunte Wright, It was a police-involved shooting. A female officer apparently meant to pull out her taser, and she said, mentions it, taser, I'm going to tase you. Accidentally, it seems to be the case, pulled out her sidearm and shot the individual as he drove off. The individual, not clear what exactly happened. He did have a warrant out for him. He did have an illegal weapon, but he wasn't using his weapon during that time. Now, we're going to see these riots again probably continue for quite a while, because here's the important thing to note. There are, of course, ongoing shootings of police officers against unarmed people pretty often in the U.S. I mean, not that often, maybe 20 a year-ish when it comes to these types of cases. What you have are individuals pre-planning riots, waiting for a catalyst. Remember, folks, when you're dealing with professional agitators, when you're dealing with people whose jobs, whose donations, whose livelihoods rely on people giving them donations and government contracts giving them money to continue pushing radical agendas, what's going to happen if you have a nonprofit organization or a full-time business and people employed in it? You have a CEO, you have people employed, you have activists, all of whom have paychecks, and it is their job. What happens when those people get what they want, when they get their demands? Do you think they just go home? Do you think they just fold their company? Do you think they say, we got everything we wanted, time to go home? Right? We got everything we wanted, time to fold the nonprofit we formed, everybody's fired, go find other jobs. Or do you think they're going to keep making demands? Right? BLM is a organization. BLM is an organization with leaders. It has paid employees. It has people working this as jobs. And as they mentioned before, they are trained Marxists. They're pushing for a Marxist agenda. You might remember, even on their own website, they were talking, for example, about ending the nuclear family. What does dismantling the nuclear family have to do with racial equality? And here we have another story. New York Post reports this. Marxist BLM leader buys $1.4 million home in ritzy LA enclave. It says Patrice Kahn-Kullers, the leader of the Black Lives Matter and a self-described Marxist, recently purchased a $1.4 million home in an exclusive Los Angeles neighborhood where the vast majority of residents are white, according to her reports. Now, in my opinion, I think this is a sign that she's a true Marxist, because only a true Marxist would condemn the rich while making themselves rich. Only a true Marxist would condemn inequality while giving themselves more, let's say, money and wealth disproportionate to the people they're trying to lead. Only a true Marxist would disregard the people they're supposed to lead and use the money they give them for, to embellish their own interests. And so I'd say, maybe she is a real Marxist, right? Now, folks, that said, I'll be doing these live Q&As every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And, just on this stuff, again, you're dealing, on a more serious note, you're dealing with organizations that do this. These are organizations that do this as a job. Meeting one demand is not going to make them fold their organization. They're not going to disband their nonprofits just because their demands are met. They're going to work on new demands. That's typically how the quote-unquote dialectic works when it comes to Marxist movements. It's just a method of slowly dismantling these systems of capitalism, dismantling the systems of traditional morality, dismantling the systems of social harmony, leading to the demoralization and destabilization of a country to bring about the type of government and governmental systems they want. It is just a pawn in a bigger game, and that's exactly how the leaders of these organizations tend to use oftentimes people who are well-meaning and are being dragged along by the narratives, right? It is narrative manipulation of people who believe the narratives. Lenin called these people useful idiots. Mao Zedong had individuals just like this called the Red Guards. He used them for his Cultural Revolution, and we didn't need him anymore. Sent him out to the countryside, made them all peasants. You see this kind of stuff happening under every communist movement. Sheila Marie, you mentioned communism series update, Josh. Still working on it, briefly delayed, unfortunately, just because we're working on another kind of emergency program that we want to make on the Constitution. But we're working on it. We're already filming it, actually. we're already in the filming stage, and so hopefully we'll have something to show you all soon. Those of you interested, we do have a series on communism that we're currently putting together. I think you'll all find it very, very interesting. It's a bit out still. Maybe we'll have to see before we get the first one done. But we are in the process of filming it currently. We're working on a few big special feature series currently, and so a lot going on behind the scenes here. You can see I'm on the road again. A lot going on behind the scenes, folks. So stay tuned. We have some great stuff to announce. And folks, you're all great. Always very much enjoy doing these Q&As. I mentioned before, too, every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, I'll be doing these live Q&As, so be sure to tune in again this coming Thursday. Again, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And folks, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.